live. I'm just going to check with my colleagues. Great, we are live. Last one of the year, David. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
We thought it would be a good idea to do a bit of a review of 2020 because some people say that 2020 has been an interesting year. So it would be a good idea to do a bit of a review.
Oh, sorry, there we go. I'm hearing you back.
No problem. Probably best to mute our own Facebooks there. But yeah, some people say it's been a bit of an interesting year, so we thought we'd better do a bit of a review. What do you think, David?
I think so. I mean, it's a little bit interesting, just common or garden sort of variety.
Yeah, there's a few different things that I think we need to discuss, and I think maybe let's just start at the beginning. Actually, David, I've got a little presentation here, so I'm going to see if I can share this, and hopefully everyone will be able to see it. And let's get that full screen. How does that look?
Very good, very nice graphics. Right, sorry, my distraction is over. I managed to share this on my own page, okay. So there we go. People can know that we're trying to put the world to rights.
Yeah, right. Well, it says January 2020 because, believe it or not, at the beginning of this year, no one knew what this year was going to turn out like, and no one knew it was going to end up being the way it has. So, David, back in January 2020, what did you think was going to happen this year?
Obviously, it's so hard to think, as you say, that there's so much has happened. But I think what we were looking at, particularly for those of us working with students at tennis schools here in the UK, was sort of the continuation of the trend that we're seeing of increasing numbers of students looking to accent their UCAS applications with international applications, and that steady drip of more UK schools becoming more skilled at supporting students with those applications was coming. And so it just seemed to be this sort of year-on-year growth and development of all the things that have been happening over 4 or 5 years, and which you and your colleagues at UES and we at the university guys have been supporting schools with. And I was actually generally really quite excited about it because it's been really good to see our sectors work in a way that we think is a really positive benefit to them.
Yeah, I agree with you, David. I think at the beginning of this year, we thought, okay, the numbers are going up to in terms of applications to America and worldwide, and we knew that we'd put a lot of effort in together into helping schools and students understand what that looks like and what you've got to do to maximize your chances. And we thought now is going to be the year where we can really make the most of that expertise and knowledge. And then, of course, someone goes and pulls the rug out from under us. So yeah. Let's move on. Let's see what the next Christmas cracker has. So we made some predictions about the year. You just mentioned some of them. And then there was a pandemic that broke out.
Was it?
Yeah, apparently. It feels like it's been here forever. But this pandemic, believe it or not, actually started this year. And we immediately made some predictions, David. I don't even remember what they were, but we made some predictions about what would happen. Do you remember what it was that we thought was going to happen?
I think we thought there would be a quite significant decline in interest of studying abroad, partly because of the financial impact it has, but also borders and flights and transport and things mattered, which I think did happen. And I think we thought that, in the same way as everybody has, people were kind of struggling to come up with new ways of doing things, and it was going to be complicated.
Yeah, that's a nice vague way of saying that our predictions were completely wrong. I think we made some predictions about, or I certainly made some predictions about how the test companies were going to step up and make at-home testing a realization. And that didn't happen, at least not with the major ones for the US undergraduate, the SAT and ACT. In fact, the opposite. There were fewer tests, and it was much harder for people to do things. But actually, on a positive note, we did see it with some other test companies. So GMAC, ETS, who do GRE, IELTS, TOEFL, they all ended up having at-home testing online, which worked out quite well. So that prediction kind of half came true. How did you think that it was going to affect applications this year? And I remember you talking at the beginning, David, about people deferring and whether or not they would do that. What did you think was going to happen with numbers of applicants?
Yeah, I think my senses was people were going to retreat to what they felt was safe. Safe in terms of the physical sense of it, but safe also in terms of known quantities, be that subjects, be that universities. So I think we definitely saw a lot of that. You know, when stuff is really challenging, you go for what you know. I think it's really hard to not look back at it and say, well, knowing what happened, particularly just how problematic it is. The thing I think about with looking back at stuff and seeing all these other reviews of the years in educational press and stuff is I think so much, and I'll put my hand up to this, we assume it's a zero-sum game, that we were seeing just one part of it. And I think one of the interesting factors is that students have behaved quite rationally for them, but for them it wasn't this or this. I think back to a student I worked with, an international student who had offers from 3 different countries. And she chose the UK, not because she thought the UK was going to be a palatable place to come to university, but it was more palatable than the other 2 options that she had. And I think that's a lot of things. When you think about students, I remember Nick Hillman from HEPI on the radio when this was all starting, and them people were, I think, put on Radio 4, someone saying, look, everyone's going to defer, aren't they? They're going to stay on a gap year. I'm saying, well, if you've been locked up at home with your parents for 7 months and you're 19, going to university is still probably better than another year at home with your mum and dad. It's not like you'll be off surfing in Australia or backpacking around Thailand. And I think if we assume rationality from students based on their own preferences, then it makes sense. It's just then we're deciding on teenagers being rational, and that's probably why it's quite unpredictable.
Yeah. Okay. Well, on that note, let's move on to another topic, which was let's start with the decisions and offers. When I say 2020, I mean the people that were starting to get their decisions from US colleges and UCAS offers at the end of 2019 and beginning of 2020. At that point, of course, nothing major had happened. How was it starting to look at that point from your perspective? Were the numbers up in 2000 for the 2020 entry compared to previous years?
Yeah, I think the really noticeable thing, and it's because of the timing for the US of when it hit, was the huge increase in waitlist activity. In that US universities want to get the exact right number of people in their university, something that friends I know who work in admissions are aware of, but we maybe tend to overlook. It's about beds. That is the metric you've got. How many beds have you got? And universities use wait lists to maybe come in under and then go off, and if they don't yield the money that they expected to, they can go to their wait list. I had 7, 8, 9 times more people on wait lists than I would ever normally have. Students on 4 or 5 wait lists. Because if you're a university admissions officer, you're the enrollment manager, that's how you hedge your bets. You hang on to more people and see what you can do. And so I think that was the first sign. And obviously for us working with international students, we're used to students making decisions when they've maybe never seen a place or seen a place once. For a bunch of US colleges, the major factor is what they call a yield event, is when they get their offer holders on campus and they just roll out the red carpet. I mean, there's the companies that help people curate these events. That is when they sell the college to the people they made the offers to, and those didn't happen. So the wait list was a huge thing. And then I had a very clear metric as to your likelihood of getting off a wait list or not. And the metric was, if you legally could get to the US without a visa, then you were getting off wait lists because you didn't need to go to an embassy or something. If you needed a visa, that was not happening because there was physically no way of getting one. So I had some students who ended up doing very well getting off wait lists because they weren't now competing with everybody. They were competing with the people who would accept a waitlist spot, who had the means to pay, and who could. I joked with one family and said, look, you could do Greta Thunberg. You can get on a boat. As long as you can get to America somewhere, you can get to the college. Whereas our students can't get to the embassy in London or wherever they're living, even if there are flights. And so that made a massive difference. Then in the back of that, and particularly the university guys, we tend to work with a lot of students who are boarding in the UK but home is somewhere else, where suddenly for them, they couldn't get out of their country. And so we were suddenly looking at last minute applications to universities in their own country, even in one case negotiating with a university where the student would in effect study abroad first. So rather than enrolling at the university, doing a year or two and then studying abroad in another country, they enrolled at an American accredited university in their home country where they knew they could start, with the idea being, and it's still not happened yet, eventually they can get to the US. So all these kind of little things made it very complicated.
That is interesting. It's particularly interesting about the waitlist thing. I'm very fortunate for those students, because normally, for some of these colleges, we know that they waitlist a lot of people, and a waitlist is by no means a guarantee. In fact, you can normally assume that, or you should assume that you're not going to get offered. So that is interesting. Okay, let's look what's next. I mean, you touched on this a bit, but as soon as the pandemic happened, there were some very different reactions from colleges. We saw some who were going to accept deferrals left, right, and centre, some who absolutely clear that they wouldn't be deferring anyone, and you either decided to come or you didn't. How do you see the differences in the college's reactions, and how do you think that affected the way that students saw those colleges?
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. It's something that I think people forget when they look at colleges and universities. University doesn't exist. Its main priority isn't to educate students. That's obviously what they do, but its main priority is to continue to exist. That's the number one priority of the university. When we look at what happens with the US admissions, their institutional priorities are always the thing that comes first. What do they have to do to continue to exist? And so when you look at the different reactions colleges make, I think you could look at it on basis of how much of an existential threat was the pandemic to them, or to the kind of government state-backed organization of which they're part. So there were some colleges, even now, I saw some stats earlier from Georgetown Early Action, who are still, reporting a middle 50 ACT and SAT for their admitted students. But Georgetown's policy was basically, we really do want you to test, and if you're not setting testing, you have to have a really good explanation as to why you didn't. Well, if you understand the context of Georgetown and how they run their admissions process, then that makes sense on their institutional priorities, whereas a school that's maybe very dependent on international students and is not hugely selective is going to react in a completely different way. So on the whole spectrum, we had places that went test optional immediately, possibly because they'd always wanted to be, and this was a really nice excuse to get it through the board, to places that still are not test optional because the state controls them, and that state is dominated by a political grouping which doesn't think that they should be changing these things, and the pandemic should just be allowed to get on with itself, and everything in between. So it's been difficult navigating that.
Yeah. And were there any colleges for you that stood out, that behaved in a very good way immediately?
I think both for those who maybe behaved in a way that we wanted them to do, which was relaxing policies left, right, and centre, or those that didn't, I think it was clarity was the thing. There was an interesting one. I think there was a whole phase where almost every sort of day, you and I and your colleague Simon were WhatsApping about a new announcement about test optional and trying to pass the language of work it was. And I remember a phase where Cornell, over the course of a week, had a statement which then changed and changed and changed. But I remember people from Cornell being very public about what was happening and how it was going on and what they were doing and how it works. And if, Cornell is half public, half private, some of that makes sense. But that was something where it was good to see the thinking that was going through. I think you look at university websites now, it's the clarity are the ones that I like. But that tends to also be the ones which have long-standing, very well-regarded admissions counsellors, people who are embedded in their communities, people who, it's hard to work out where they end and the university starts. They got the messages out there very quickly. The ones who maybe have seen international students as a little bit more of a means to an end financially are the ones where we end up with some difficult situations.
Okay. Right, let's see what's next in our Christmas cracker surprise. Test optional. Yeah, that was a big one for us. Obviously, we do a lot of test prep and a lot of helping students, and normally testing is a very big consideration for students applying to America. I would say that this year it was an even bigger consideration, and that it might surprise you because a lot of colleges went test optional when the pandemic hit. and about 1,000 out of the 1,500 four-year colleges and universities are now test optional or test blind. But I think the reason that it took so much time for students and so much consideration was because students suddenly didn't really know what they were supposed to do. Should they be submitting scores? Should they bother continuing to test? Should they risk traveling to go and take a test, or was it better just to hedge their bets, not do it, and hope that the college understands? And as you were saying, there were some mixed messages coming from some of the colleges about what was going on. It wasn't clear that some of them were going to go test optional. And even now there are colleges, notably in Florida, that require tests. And that made, I think, things very confusing for students, and actually meant that they spent quite a lot of time either preparing or thinking about the test. Did you experience the same, David?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things with the test optional thing that I'm reflecting on, which I think is interesting. I think we're going to talk about 2021 cycle soon, and I'll hold one back for then, because I think it's by far the biggest thing that we're seeing as a live issue right now, which is the impact it had on application numbers. I think what test optional has done has highlighted something that those of us who live and breathe this stuff have known for ages, but which is hard for people in the UK mindset to get their head round, which is this depends. And it's the joke of college counselling conferences all the time when we all say, well, the answer to that is it depends. But testing was also an it depends issue. You know, which tests you took, when you took them, and which results you sent to whom was always an important part of the process. I just don't think a lot of students in the UK and a lot of their schools knew that, because we're used to, here are the entry requirements. We could both tell stories of students who've put their SAT score on the Common App and submitted to every university, including universities where actually they probably didn't need to see that score, and you send it to them is not going to help you. I think test optionals just meant that that complication is now more obvious. And you mentioned you test blinds, you know, we've got test free, all the history was what's happened in the University of California and court cases and things. I think this has just really brought it out into the open. The US stuff is much more complicated than I think people thought it was. I think we knew it was, but I think that's the change. It's now really obvious. And it comes back to something which I think, and anyone who's listened to me do other stuff knows that I believe is fundamentally important to this process, is know what you're applying for first, and then do the things you need to do. And so many students will take a test and then work out where they're applying. Because in our model, it's like A-levels or an IB. What grades have I got? Then where can I apply? Test optional means you shouldn't be going near the testing until you've worked out what kind of universities you're applying to, because that is then going to mean that you are going to test in a different way. You're going to prepare in a different way. How important is the testing to what you're going to do, if at all? So I don't know. Hopefully we might end up with this situation the way around, Jason, rather than coming to you first for test prep and you say, well, maybe we need a college counsellor. Then maybe they might need college counsellors first, and then we can say, well, now you need to do test prep.
You can only wish. That's probably not going to change, at least internationally, because the first thing that people hear about is a test. They think, I want to go to America, we'll do tests. Yeah. And I don't think that's going to change. I think I always find that when things become more confusing for students, they tend to focus on the quantifiable things, and the tests are a quantifiable part of that process, at least quantifiable in that you get a number when you take the test. But what they don't realise is that number itself is used in different ways at different places and depending on your background. So I think we'll still see students come to us first for test prep, but there'll be a lot of discussion with those students about, is this right for you? Are you sure you need to do this? Maybe you should work out what sort of places are right for you first. I think one thing I would always say is that whichever bit you're going to start with, start early, because it's okay to start with test prep 2 years beforehand, even if it's not right for you, because you will find that out during the process. What you don't want to do is find that out in your last term of school, because that's never a good position to be in.
Yeah, I think for me, and my thinking on this has changed a little bit over the pandemic, is I think test optional is on the whole a good thing in that it gives flexibility. but I think it puts a greater responsibility on schools, particularly schools in the UK that we work, to have a greater level of understanding about this. I think that bit worries me. I think it's now much easier for schools to end up without, and there's nothing, I mean, criticizing them for it, they're just naively not aware of it, of putting students down a route which could end up causing them a difficulty. And I don't think that we had that as much before, but we could end up with a student getting a test score which disadvantages them at a university which is test optional, but says, if you do have a test, we need to see the score.
Yeah.
And that worries me a little bit, that college counselling was always a complex thing for the US. And you and I have talked about this, that we both earn a living from doing it. That means we serve a certain sector of the market which has the means to pay for it. I think test optional puts an even greater priority on having good advice. And a lot of students just can't access that advice in the sort of granular way that they might need, and don't even know, and aren't attending a school that knows that this actually is much more complicated than they think it is.
Yeah, I agree. Excuse me. There was another major event this year as a result of the pandemic, which was the GCSE and A-level and IB exams. And obviously they all disappeared quite rapidly when it was clear that no one was going to be able to take them. What do you think about what happened? I mean, there were some not very good things that happened here, but overall, how do you think it went?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that we have to say is, obviously, it was, and we're seeing this again now, we don't have a national system, we have a devolved system, and I think the politics of that played quite a significant role in this. I remember writing my September newsletter that goes out to counsellors and saying, regardless of what we view about this, at least one thing is true, that it's at least told everybody that advising students on how to get to university is harder than you think it is. The concern, I think the shock maybe within the sector, advisors and admissions and recruitment staff, is we know that the UCAS model is designed on kids not getting grades. That is what the system is designed on. Otherwise, we wouldn't have conditional offers. Universities make many more offers than they have spots for. And so I think everyone was kind of slightly unbelieving that actually they would just go back to the centigrades when the statistics were showing that just how significantly inflated they were. And again, no blame attached. That's just the reality of it. And so once you've gone down that route of, well, we are going to award grades, then universities make the decisions based on, well, yes, we'll carry on with that process. And then to have the rug pulled out from under them for very wise political reasons is complicated. But getting into university is not fair. That's just a reality of it. It is not fair. Why should a kid with lower grades who happens to be a better field hockey player get into a top 8 US university rather than the kid with stellar grades that can tell one end of a hockey stick from another? That's not fair on an academic sense, but that's how it works. People miss the grades. The problem with this is that the government were the ones being blamed for it rather than the exam boards. And so that's a political thing and it has to be done with it. I don't think there was any way the system could have worked otherwise. Our system in the UK is based on high stakes exams. We had to award grades. Grades were awarded. Politically, that ended up in a way that no one was happy with, and poor universities are told, do you want to go out and get a deal with a marquee company and find more space to put more kids into classes? And they did it. Amazingly, they did it. And I don't know how. I can't see it. Yeah, so easy with hindsight to go back and criticise, and some people listening on will know I have a family history with politics and I'm always quite sympathetic to politicians. I don't know what else they could have done. I think in the scenario, they made decisions that any reasonable person would have made in the same place. It just now means we have so significant knock-on implications of that. Yeah, the number of students who gained, I may get this slightly wrong, but it's something like the number of students who gained 3 A stars or the equivalent at A-level went up by a third, something like that. So there are more students around with these grades. That has an impact for things like medical admissions this year. There are some UK medical schools which tier their applicants by their achieved or predicted grades. When you've got more students who've achieved higher grades, then that's fewer students from the current year who can be shortlisted for these kind of things. Then how do you make that fair for the year below and the year below? It just has consequences which are logical, and no one's intending them. It just happens. But it's once the decision was made that we will award grades, then this just all becomes the next logical step from it.
Yeah. And do you think, because one of the things that I was thinking is that as a result of these A-level and GCSE results being dependent on the school's history, the performance of the student in class, how the teachers think about them, it starts to tend more towards this kind of holistic viewpoint about grades than the normal, very quantifiable system that we have. Do you think there's an argument that we should move more towards a system like in the US where there is continuous assessment and it's not so much about high stakes exams at the end?
I've had these discussions before in position leadership at school when we were able to think these thoughts. I think there's so much culture embedded in it. Wonky, the website which gathers all the thought leadership stuff about UK admissions, is doing a series of pieces on admissions in other parts of the world. I contributed an article, and they're looking at this kind of stuff. And the message keeps coming out is the UK is unusual, but we have a culture of high stakes exams at 16 and 18. That's very hard to unravel. And so if we're saying that this is the system we have, then what do we do about that? I mean, I go back into all sorts of geekdom as me as a historian. I wrote my history thesis on the introduction of comprehensive schools, which is a sad thing to do, but I want to be a teacher, so there we go. And one of the things you look at there is when you're designing a new school system, you're not starting from the fact that there are no schools. They're already physical buildings called schools. And so if you turn the grammar school into a comprehensive and the secondary modern to a comprehensive, people already think things about those. And so the same with exam systems and what we're doing now. People already have a perception of how our system should work. And so it's not like Men in Black where you wipe people's minds and everyone forgets how it works and here's a new system. Anything that we would do to change it is still going to be viewed as it better or worse than what happened before. I mean, we're working with students with 9s and 8s and 7s, and their parents still tell me they've got A stars, A's and B's because they're translating old money to new money. And so I think we're just going to work this out. We will get used to this. The consequences of this will continue to go on and on and on. And we'll deal with it the best we can do. And I think that's the only realistic thing that we can do. I tend to lean towards conservatism rather than revolution. And it's just a case of let's deal with what's in front of us.
I think preferably for me, a system where it didn't hang so delicately on the final exams would be a good thing. But like you say, it's very, very hard to change people's minds about that. Okay, what is next? Well, counsellors' jobs, and that includes us, David. How has this year changed what counsellors in a school do, particularly ones in the UK and Europe? And how has it affected what we do as private counsellors?
Yeah, so I feel for school counsellors, I really do. It's a tough job. I think many are very fortunate to be in schools, particularly international schools, where they are supported and well regarded, and the people running schools understand just what a big deal it is. I think in a number of schools, it's sort of the forgotten thing that we have someone who does it, and that's fine, and you only realise that you need them when something happens. I know of some schools, I won't name them, but they put their counsellors on furlough, or head of careers or head of higher education, and you can get to understand the pressures of keeping school open and finances. And then people realise that, oh, well, we can't answer that email or that email or this angry family, and so we better bring that person back. And so the only blessing, I guess, is people, again, as I say, realising that this is really important work. It's it's the outcome people want. This is what happens after you leave school. That's pretty important. But the biggest concern I have is it didn't stop this year. That normally, if you're thinking in many schools in the UK, you're finishing in July and then you've got the gap till August. Maybe there's IB results or BTEC results in there, but people have a time off. It didn't happen. And that gives me great concern for the well-being of people, the ability to actually do the work, which is intensive work. It's individual working with a student. It's not a cookie cutter approach. And so for school counsel, I think that's really complicated. I hope, and I know from talking to some school leaders and stuff, actually, that people have seen this and think, you know what, we didn't get this right last year. We didn't support our team, or we didn't have a team. And actually, this now is something we need to know that people are clued into. And it's not, I wouldn't say it's not just the pandemic. We're in the middle of it, we obviously had Brexit and fee status things changing. And there were some schools which hadn't told their EU borders that their fee status might be changing. That's a fairly shocking oversight, but it's not the fault of the person that's called in advising if they're being given no time allocation to do it and they can't pay attention to this kind of stuff. So for them, I think it's different. I think leading on to that, for private counsellors, it behooves us even more to try and support schools and get information out there. We have the privilege of working directly for families and having the time to do this. And therefore, with that should come the desire to spread information around much more and help people out with that kind of stuff. I think the challenge that comes with that, though, is the demanding aspect, again, from parents who are expecting answers to things which they just aren't. And again, the analogy of, I remember using one of my newsletters, was this idea of, we're building the plane whilst flying it, which we were using our insight and our knowledge to try and think, okay, in this scenario, how's it going to be? And then remembering the fact that the kids and their parents are strapped in the back of the plane whilst we're doing it. And that's quite a challenge as well.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about the mental well-being of teachers in general having to work so hard in schools this year. I think on the other side of that is it really brought home how being a school counsellor, and when we say that, we mean someone who is helping students get into universities. But the reason it has counselling in the title is because you are talking to students about their lives, like what do they want to do after school? What are actually their ambitions and their hopes and dreams? And this year I found that my conversations with students were much more about that than they have ever been before, because students were really worried. Like, if I take this offer, what is that going to mean for me next year? Like, how am I going to feel personally when I'm at this university and it's like this? And I think it really drilled home how important that side of the job is, whether you're doing it privately or in a school.
Great. It's a privilege to do the work. It really is. But it comes with the challenge of trying to help people navigate things which we were all navigating ourselves.
Exactly. Well, you mentioned politics already, David. Let's talk about politics on the other side of the pond. I don't know if you heard, there was an election in America. I think it's just about finished now, actually. It's been going on.
Well, let's see.
No doubt most people in the education sector will be fairly happy with the result. I don't think we need to pretend otherwise there. And certainly from my experience, most students are fairly relieved. I'm not going to ask you how you feel about it, David, but in general, what do you think that this result means for the future of international students in America?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with you, and all politics is local. I mean, that's the crucial thing of understanding as someone who's taught it. All politics is local. I think regardless of your views of the politics of Trump versus Biden, there is absolutely no debate, and I've got some of the books behind me on the shelves, so it was an unstable administration and stuff changed quickly. And that's quite hard when you're planning to spend 4 years of your life somewhere, to find things and rules changing really quickly. And I think that was where it was becoming the point. And we talked about the kids who were supposed to be going in August 2020. Immigration rules suddenly changing overnight. I'm just going, how can I send my child somewhere where I don't know what the rules are going to be? And so at least the fact of, if there'd been a primary challenge for Trump and it was another Republican, but someone who kind of played more within the established rules, I think we'd have been in the same situation. It was just that we didn't know what was going to happen. We need a functional administration in the US which abides by the generally sort of seen norms about how you do things.
Mm-hmm.
With the Biden administration, we will get that. I don't think it's him being a Democrat. It's just he is part of the sort of the standard way of doing things. And that means that we can plan and students can feel comfortable about going for things. I think we're a little isolated from it in Western Europe in terms of the fact that we have great higher education systems that people will still come to. It's not as if staying in the UK is suddenly an awful prospect compared to going to the US. The big impact of parts of the world where that's not necessarily the case. And you look at the Open Doors report that came out recently, the drops of people going to the US are from the places where the Trump administration was causing problems. China, which dwarfs the UK as a sending country to the US. And we're minuscule compared to the number of Chinese students. And a lot of them didn't come because of the politics. And that worries me because I have friends, close friends, whose livelihoods depend on a lot of students from China being able to come to their universities. And a lot of people didn't come. I mean, the statistics are horrific as enrollment drops at some US universities. And so if some sense of stability can bring that back, then I think we're all in for a good thing, regardless of anyone's political views as to whether this is the right political direction for the US or not.
I completely agree with you. I think that if it, as you said, if it had been a Republican who might have a different ideology to what other people want, it wouldn't have mattered as long as that person played by the rules that we normally expect and provided some stability and certainty about what was going on. I think that's, as you said, been the really difficult thing this year and in previous years, that you just didn't know what was going to happen from one day to the next. And you could see that in students' anxiety about going to America. And I certainly had students who really thought twice about going. And I had students this year who said they were waiting to hear from the results of the election about whether they would have bothered to apply this year. And I think there's a bit of a relief there that things will go back a little bit more to normal. And I think generally, it's not just education, is it? It's everything. It's just normal kind of relationships between countries and therefore people makes people's lives easier. And in addition to what you said about students from certain countries and what it means for your friends whose living depends on that, I think generally having students who study in different countries and swap between countries is a good thing for the world. We can all learn from each other. And I think it's a travesty when people put up barriers to that, sometimes literally.
Yes, agree 100%. The one thing I will say, and again, we'll talk about it's not being a zero-sum game, is the numbers of students that we're working with who want to do the reverse journey is quite significantly up. I don't think that's just the politics of it, but I think the politics of it has opened a lot of Americans' eyes to some of the deep-seated problems in the country, which, I mean, it's quite interesting reading Barack Obama's book right now, that maybe he was able to paper over for a period of time. We have an awful lot of students who are saying, actually, I want out. The UK looks like a pretty good place to be at college for the next 3 or 4 years, which is an interesting factor. We seem to assume this is all one-way traffic, but American students can go to other countries just as well as international students can come to the US, and I think increasingly that a lot of them are looking to do so.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think when you reside in a country, you get a better insight into its problems, and I'm sure there are plenty of students in the UK who know much better the problems in the UK than the students in America and elsewhere. So hopefully they won't come here and change their minds. Okay, what's next? Right, decisions and offers this year. So we talked a little bit about this, but previously we were talking about what was happening to those students who had applied for entry this year and then suddenly they were waitlisted and that sort of thing. So far, obviously it's early doors, and I think today there'll be quite a lot of students getting their early decisions. What have you experienced so far with students who've applied early?
Yeah, so I think this is one thing where I can say my prediction did come true. So I'll take this one and stick it to my wall. There is a phenomenon that we all experience, yourselves at UES, us, UK schools, of student walking into an office or getting in touch in around October, going, I want to apply to insert name brand US college here, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, whatever. And us all going, it's probably not going to happen, I'm afraid. The testing is quite a big factor here and you just haven't done anything. And this year that didn't happen because you could at that point go, actually you could. Every single year I've worked in this, I've had the difficult conversations with parents where the students' school grades, A-levels, IB, are phenomenal. But their testing was either non-existent because they were too late, or they just never put the work in for it, or they just couldn't get it. So you've got a student with 3 A stars or 44, 45 IB and 1200 SAT, 28 ACT. And you'd have the conversation of, look, it's just not worth it. You are not competitive for the sort of universities that you could access in the UK, in the US, because of that test score. That conversation never had to happen this year because based on everything we were hearing from these very, very selected universities, you would not be penalised for being test optional. And so those students did apply. I saw it in my caseload. I know you guys saw it at UES. Discussions we've all had with schools around the UK, they saw the same as well. And therefore, it is not at all surprising to hear statistics of universities up a third, 40%, 60% in application numbers in the early round for the same, or remember with deferrals, fewer spots than previous year. What that means, therefore, is at the most selective end, it is even more cutthroat than it ever was. And you're talking about colleges which take 1 out of 20 applicants anyway. When you suddenly add another couple of thousand applications, then is it 1 out of 30, 1 out of 40? And so there are going to be a lot of extraordinarily talented UK students who don't get in to the colleges that they were competitive for because there were just more people able to apply. So at that end, I think it's crazy. And the decisions already you've seen, we've had Stanford, we've had Georgetown, we've had BU, Georgia Tech and places are harsh. And I think tonight, tomorrow, early next week, when we see more places, it's going to be exactly the same as well, because it's just been a bigger field of equally strong candidates where it's almost impossible to choose between them. The flip side of that is a lot of those students who we were having those conversations with about, you know, what, you're not competitive this. Well, I still want to go to the US. Okay, well, here's colleges that you can look at. And that's where maybe students would have fallen in love with still phenomenal colleges, but weren't quite as competitive. Those students didn't apply to those places. And so the pool of universities in a sort of mid-tier in the US, I think, looks significantly weaker this year. We're already seeing moves from some colleges extending their deadlines, bringing in an early decision to, you know, trying to be more generous with bringing students in, because they must be looking at their early pools and going, where did 2,000 kids go? Well, those 2,000 kids went to Harvard or Stanford or Yale. They didn't have to trade down to you. And so I've had students who I thought were relatively weak for some really solid universities applying for, get in, get offered scholarships, because the universities want to lock in their class early. And they're terrified about what's happening elsewhere. Where did all those students go? And so I think it's a very, very bipolar situation. Basically, if it's a really selective US university that people in the UK have heard of, I think it's going to be absolutely carnage. If it's a solid US university, which maybe doesn't have the brand recognition, and your A's and B's, I think you're going to get some very generous offers.
That's a very good tip, and something I've been telling people as well, saying, please, I mean, we always say this, please consider applying to places outside of those big brand names. There are some amazing places out there you have a better shot at, precisely because fewer international people are applying to them. Would you say it is too late now? I mean, we've got a couple of weeks before the, at least ostensibly the deadline for RD. Would you say if a student has written applications to a number of very top universities, should they just put a bit of effort in to apply to a couple of other places now that are a little bit off the radar?
Yes, you still have to go down demonstrated interest, you know, to those kind of things. I mean, look at what the essay requirements are. There's some great colleges which don't actually require supplemental essays, which is fantastic in terms of things. They're not tracking demonstrated interest. So yes, I mean, if your dream is still to go to the US, then look at it. But if you work through the logic of this, and this is again me hypothesizing, if in effect there are a bunch of students who've over applied this year, they've applied to places that they're not going to get into just on the numbers. So if we've gone from 6,000 to 9,000 people applying to a university, well, a lot of those, more of those are going to get denied, who are going to be looking for something else in the next pool. So they're going to maybe trade down to the colleges that they would have had to have applied to if we'd had tests required everywhere. Well, then what happens in March, April? Are we then going to still have a bunch of very qualified candidates who are still then looking to trade down somewhere else? So might we get early decision 3? Might there be another little cycle going on? The NACAC rules now mean that you can still do this kind of stuff. And so I think there's actually potentially still matches to be had. There could be some very well-regarded universities still looking for students in April, May, June this year.
Interesting. Okay, that's a good tip, and you heard it here for free. Okay. For students that did go to university in the end in America started this year, have you had many reports from those students about what life is like on campus for them?
And not many of mine were able to go. The US citizens were. And I would say it's better than they feared, better than being stuck at home learning online, but definitely not what it would be in a normal year. Universities have done a good job. with teething problems, issues with testing, with access to food for people being in quarantine, with, again, just all these things which are an absolute pain, but you just got to think reasonable people are trying their best to do this. No one is deliberately trying to send the wrong food to a student who's got dietary issues. These are mistakes. They were really unfortunate. I think for the people who've got there, it's been okay. I think the online stuff has been miserable. And the comparison is tough. If you are sitting here in the UK 5, 6, 8 hours behind trying to stick into classes with people who are actually on campus, and then your mates are here on campus themselves and you're seeing the social media and everything about it, that's pretty miserable. And a number of students have decided that, you know what, either sack it off and put in a late application to UCAS, or let's request a deferral and see what we can do, particularly when actually life sort of got a little bit back to normal, where you could get out, you could go to a restaurant, you could see people. And so it's not been fun. And I think anyone who's an observer of the US, who understands the importance of the different states and the political bifurcation and the sort of live free or die idea, this idea that we control our own lives, will look at the US and know that they are not set up to sort this out as well as other parts of the world are. It's just the culture doesn't work in its favor. And I have a lot of students who go, is next year, if I defer for a year, is campus life for 2021 enrollment going to be any better? And there are parts of the US you go, probably not. And so that's the challenge as well.
Yeah, I agree. This year I had the odd situation of trying to convince students who had got into very, very good American universities that it was probably still worth going, because yes, you might have a really different experience this year, but then you've got 3 years after that of what is probably going to be a much more normal and really good experience there. But I still completely agree with them. Why am I going to spend this money if I'm just going to be sitting at home, as you say, in the UK, going to these online lectures, and I can't do anything. I'm not on a campus here either. It seems like a massive waste of money for a year, and it's hard to disagree with that. And we're talking here about universities that just wouldn't let them defer. And I think that was a real shame for those students who were clearly good enough to study at some of these very good places and would have had an amazing experience in the next 3 years, but decided to turn it down for somewhere, let's face it, much less exciting in the UK.
We said it depends. Everyone makes their decisions based on their own priorities. And I think it's important to acknowledge there are some students for whom actually this is fine. Online learning works better for them. There are people who, for better or ill, they want a name brand, and their parents have spent the money and created the kid's life in a way to get them this place. And so they will do it. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. I think it just highlights, again, this idea of the choices that people can make in this kind of stuff. And again, the idea of it not being a zero-sum game, the fact that some students are very fortunate to have 3 or 4 countries that they could choose to go to for university, and they pick the one where it seems to be the least worst option. And the stats seem to bear it out. The UK seemed to be that option compared to the USA or Canada.
Right, let's see what's next. I think this is the last one. What are our predictions now, David?
Yeah, well, I think there's general trends, which I don't know if this is going to necessarily be accelerated by COVID, but it's just something that we're seeing. And I'll plug for teachers joining us, the events that UES and Uni and I are coordinating, bringing school advisors from various parts of the UK together to discuss things. I think more and more countries are coming on stream as being really viable options for students. And I think that's just a trend that we've seen more and more. But the virtual events that we, the University Guys and others, have run, which enable to connect a student from one country with a university in a completely different one, and the US, UK, Canada, Australia are never part of that. Germany, Austria, Scandinavia, Ireland with Brexit now really high on the agenda, India, the UAE, Qatar, there's just so many options. I think that trend is going to continue, particularly when working with students who are international students at UK boarding schools, or maybe going back to a university in their home country or nearby. It's an option. So I think that trend is going to accelerate. I think the economic hit is going to mean that people play safe. Unifrog had a great report that I did a forward for, I want to say September time, about looking at the data that they gather on all their shortlisting activities. It's fantastic what they can do with this anonymized data of how safe students are playing. They were pivoting to courses which leads to jobs, clearly. And I say this as a historian, not everyone can see what job that leads to. An aerospace engineer, you can. A mathematician, Jason, you can see what that leads to. And universities which felt had brand cachet. And so I think people are going to play safe, and understandably so. I mean, we've got to remember there are a lot of kids who have sat for 8-9 months watching the family's finances collapse. People who've not been in school for a long period of time, don't have access to counselling. People, who've had family members, seriously ill or worse. And so in that, you play safe. So, and I think we're going to see an awful lot of that. The other one that I see, and I think this is just, again, worrying, but it's the way of the world, those with money and the means to travel. I mean, we talk about vaccines now, the means to get a private vaccine, the means to quarantine somewhere else. I mean, there were statistics coming off about where all the super yachts going to, where the people who can suddenly go anywhere in the world, well, they're holding up in the Caribbean for the pandemic. I think that divide is going to be even bigger. And it worries me a little bit with Erasmus going, with the ability for students from the UK to access EU funding at the universities, that studying abroad becomes even more preserve of the wealthy. I don't know if there's anything we can do about it, but these are the concerns I have.
Yeah, I agree with you. In terms of our jobs, I mean, one of the things that has been nice, even though we've been busier than ever this year, I think one of the nice things is that we've been able to be, I don't know how you feel, but more productive, because I haven't had to spend so long sitting on trains or in cars going to places. And that's been a surprisingly upside to this, which is that there hasn't been the not just the need, but the kind of expectation and requirement that we should travel and see people face to face, and when you actually can do a lot of what we do online. Do you think that is something that will now be much more expected in the future, even when things go back to normal?
I guess so. I mean, that's, I say, way above my pay grade in terms of judgment about that. And I think this would be, I mean, as a historian, it reminds me of historical trends from centuries ago, where these things do change people's way of life and have impacts on cities. I mean, I'd be really historically geeky, but the rise of Christianity in Western Europe that suddenly reconfigured the way cities were laid out, because the churches were built on the outskirts of cities, and then over centuries the church becomes the central city and everything moves. Are we going to end up with that idea that we don't need central business districts anymore? Possibly. In terms of what we do, yeah, it's lovely to not have to travel. I've seen my kids much more than I would normally do in a year, because I don't have to stay overnight away from them when I'm visiting schools and giving talks. My mileage is down. I have less carbon footprint. My costs are down. I mean, all these things are, on the surface of them, good things, but humans are not just, economic animals, or we do the most rational thing. I miss seeing students. I miss going to schools. I miss school dinners and chatting to people. I think we all miss human interaction, but when you're used to working with young people, it's nice to sit down and talk to young people. I gave one talk at a school this year, very socially distanced, and I was giving my standard webinar that I don't know whether I've given 70 or 80 times over the course of the pandemic. And it was very odd when a student laughed at one of my jokes. I mean, it's odd normally, people know my sense of humor, but you don't get that in a webinar. You talk and people are sitting there with a glass of wine or switched off or don't really have it on, and suddenly there was live interaction. It would be a shame for that to go. Yeah, that would be the one thing I would say. Yes, it's lovely to not be contributing to the carbon footprint and to not have so many fuel bills and stuff, but I like visiting schools and working with kids and going. I'm a great devotee in counselling by wandering around. I like going and meeting a family and going for a walk and talking about the ambitions and hopes of the student and getting to know people. I hate that that's not been possible.
I agree. I've certainly missed some aspects. The international travel is something I've missed, and I'm sure you'll agree with me. Some of these conferences that we go to are, let's face it, quite good fun, and we weren't able to do that this year.
Yeah, I think we both agree that the fact that we've not had to see Simon Lewis in 8 months is probably quite a nice thing. Hello, well, Simon.
Great. I'm going to stop the presentation there, because what I wanted to check is to see whether we've got any particular questions. We do. I've been missing them. So we've got a question here. Do we think test optional is going to carry on next year?
Yes, there were places that already were. They're not going back. There are places already announced a 2 or 3 year pilot. I'm conscious of time, but in admissions, people know test optional actually enables them to bring in a better class. Better in whatever way you define it. They know this. The problem was the faculty didn't know it, the board didn't know it, the leadership didn't know it. The pandemic has given them cover to try it. And the statistics we mentioned earlier about how much stronger these early numbers are looking at some colleges, if they can show to these other stakeholders that actually we brought in a more talented, more diverse, I'll be honest, higher paying group of students by test optional, then of course they're not going to go back. So yeah, test optional is here to stay in some form or another. And when we look at California and things coming out of there, new tests, different formats of tests, could students have to take 3 or 4 different tests depending on which part of America they're applying to? That could also be part of the picture.
I agree. And actually, that's one of the predictions that I wanted to make was, I know this is something we've talked about before, but I think that there must be a third test that will come out as a rival to the SAT and ACT. We've seen it with other types of exams before. And I think the sheer inability of the very large testing organizations to develop systems and solutions to what's happened this year very rapidly means that the industry is ripe for a new player to come along and do things perhaps slightly better. What do you think about that?
I think it's ironic that the home of a lot of technology companies is in California, and California is probably the place that's going to drive this. And we forget that this over here. It's something like 11 or 12% of all students at university in America are in one of the 2 public California systems. What the UCs and the Cal States decide will impact everybody else. It did with SAT subject tests, it did with the SAT and ACT essay sections, it's going to do here. And if either of those systems decide they want to have a new test, then we'll have to come up with a new test, and there'll be tech companies that do it, and we will respond to it. I mean, we like to think international admissions is a big deal. It is for us. The vast majority of kids who go to US colleges are US, and so we will just follow in line with what they do.
I agree. Okay, a couple of questions here to finish off. First of all, do you have any advice for schools counsellors dealing with pupils who didn't get any US offers this year because they only applied to very competitive universities, and as you said, that is harder? How are counsellors going to deal with those students who suddenly come away with nothing or just being waitlisted everywhere?
Yeah, I mean, hindsight is a wonderful thing. Hopefully this was a conversation that was had earlier. I talk a lot with families, particularly when we get to October, November, because I'm conscious that I can come across as quite depressing to people, is don't just focus on the ceiling, focus on the floor. You want to focus on the dream, but I would be failing you if we didn't also make sure you had a worst case outcome that you were kind of happy with. And I think that's the issue. If you are a counsellor and you're getting this, and I say this on everything I do, join international ACAC, get on discussion groups, get the statistics to back up what you're saying. Rather than it just being, it's a tough year, or we as a school did a really bad job and angry parents are there, get the stats, get the information, show them that this is the way it was going to be. Kids have got to have options in other countries. I'd be slightly facetious, but there is some truth there. Is Canada's cool. But you've got students who are competitive enough on paper to apply to these top tier US schools, then look at Canada. McGill, the University of Toronto, and the University of British Columbia educate more undergraduates than the entire top 20 in the US. There are great outcomes at those universities, plus all the other wonderful Canadian universities. If you're predicting an A-star and 2 A's at A-level, you will likely get offers from basically every Canadian university you apply to. And if families are brand conscious, look at Canada.
Good tip. Okay, and here's a lovely question to finish off this webinar. If you had one Christmas wish for a change to US admissions for next year, what would it be?
Change to US. I mean, I can say my standard one for everywhere, which is I'd love the UK student loan to be usable outside the UK. That's just my general Christmas wish to enable more students to study abroad. One Christmas wish for US admissions. I would like the Department of Justice case that meant that the NACAC rules could go back. Yes, they were anti-competitive. Everyone accepted that, but they were anti-competitive for a really good reason. We need structures. We need processes. We need to know when there are dates and we work stuff through. I don't want another summer where I'm working all the way through July and August, still sorting out the students who you should be done by now and starting students for next year. And I'm in the fortunate position that I can pick and choose who I work with. For school counsellors, another summer that they don't get off really worries me. And if we can get back in that May the 1st matters, that is the cut-off date, and everyone has to work with that, that would make a huge difference, because then at least we know at that point we're done. And then we can plan to have a summer break.
Nice wish. My wish would be very practical. It would be that if you tick a box on the Common App that says that you're a British student, all the boxes make sense on the Common App immediately.
I've worked on that one, but yeah, we are 2 countries separated by a common language, as a wise man once said.
Great, David, we're right at 4 o'clock, so we'll finish it there. But thank you so much for taking part in this, and thank you so much for working so closely with us over the past year. I know it's been a difficult year, but there is an end in sight, and hopefully all the good bits of this job and of applying to America and elsewhere will all come back again in 2021.
Thank you. Well, likewise, thanks to you. I mean, I've been lucky to be on twice, but you've had some great guests. I'm sure all of they are grateful for the time that you guys have done with this, and to yourself and Simon and Lonnie and everyone else at UES, the great work that you guys do, the amount that you give of yourself to schools completely free to help them. The courses you and the students interact with, I know the community is also very grateful. So I wish everyone at UES a great break, a bit of time with family in whatever way that can be. And let's hope we can all reconvene somewhere in the new year.
Absolutely. David, likewise, thank you to you and for all the help that you give to schools. I know that you're a very recognised voice and face, and everyone really appreciates all the advice that you always give. So Merry Christmas to you and your family, and Merry Christmas and happy holidays to everyone who's listening, and hope to see you in 2021.